In 1989, 5 teenagers in New York City confessed to a brutal attack in Central Park. They described the crime in detail. They named each other. They sat across from detectives and said on camera that they had done it. 4 of them were between 14 and 16 years old. 1 was 17. And every single one of them was innocent. The real perpetrator, a man named Matias Reyes, confessed to the crime in 2002. DNA evidence confirmed it. The Central Park Five, later known as the Exonerated Five, had spent between 6 and 13 years in prison for something they did not do. And the most important and most disturbing question their case raises is not about the police, and not about the prosecution, and not about the media coverage that preceded the trial. It is about the confessions. How do 5 innocent people, separately, in detail, confess to a crime they did not commit? The answer sits at the intersection of psychology, interrogation science, and a set of assumptions about human behavior that almost everyone holds and almost everyone gets wrong. The core assumption is this: an innocent person would never confess to something they did not do. The cost is too high. The truth is too obvious. No rational person would trade their freedom for a false admission. That assumption is wrong, and the science proving it wrong has been building for decades. Start with what an interrogation actually is. The version most people imagine, a detective asking questions across a table, is not what modern interrogation technique looks like. The dominant method used in American law enforcement is called the Reid technique. The Reid technique was developed in the 1950s by a polygraph examiner named John Reid and has been taught to hundreds of thousands of officers across the country. It is not designed to find out what happened. It is designed to get a confession from someone the interrogator has already decided is guilty. It begins with a behavioral analysis interview, questions designed to detect deception through body language and verbal responses. Then, if the interrogator concludes the person is lying, it moves into a confrontational phase. The interrogator presents guilt as a certainty. They are not asking whether the person did it. They are telling them that they know they did it. They minimize the moral seriousness of the offense and suggest that confession will lead to more lenient treatment. They cut off denials and maintain psychological pressure for hours. The technique was built on the assumption that innocent people do not confess. That assumption is false, and the people who built it knew almost nothing about the actual psychology of sustained psychological pressure. There is a phenomenon called stress inoculation failure. Under normal conditions, most people believe they can hold out under pressure, that they would never say something untrue simply because someone was telling them it was true. This belief is accurate in low-pressure situations. It is almost completely inaccurate after 8, 10, 12 hours of sustained interrogation, sleep deprivation, psychological manipulation, and the suggestion that confession is the only way out of the room. The human nervous system was not designed to sustain resistance to sustained social pressure indefinitely. It was designed to resolve conflict, and after enough hours, the mind begins to reframe the situation entirely. Confession stops feeling like an admission of guilt and starts feeling like the thing that ends the unbearable present moment. The future, the trial, the prison, becomes abstract. The interrogation room is the only reality. And in that reality, the confession is relief. This is not speculation. It is what suspects describe when they explain why they confessed falsely. The Central Park Five, in interviews years later, described exactly this process. They had been told their friends had already confessed. They had been told that confessing would allow them to go home. They had been in the room for hours. They were teenagers. And one by one, they said what the interrogators needed to hear, and then they went home, to be arrested, charged, and convicted on the basis of those confessions. The lie that they could go home is worth pausing on. It is legal in the United States for police to lie during interrogations. They can tell a suspect that a co-conspirator has already confessed, even if they have not. They can tell a suspect that forensic evidence places them at the scene, even if it does not exist. They can tell a suspect that confessing will result in more lenient treatment, which is not within their power to promise. These lies are permitted because courts have held that confessions obtained through deception are admissible as long as the deception did not overbear the suspect's will. That phrase has been interpreted so narrowly that almost any confession qualifies as voluntary. A person who confesses after 12 hours of interrogation, after being told DNA evidence proves their guilt, after being promised they can go home if they just admit it, is considered to have confessed voluntarily. The research on false confessions identifies three main types. Voluntary false confessions happen without any interrogation pressure. People confess to famous crimes to gain attention or to protect someone else. Compliant false confessions happen when a suspect confesses because they believe, in the short term, that the confession serves their interests. They think they can recant later, or they believe the promise that they will be treated leniently. Internalized false confessions are the most disturbing. They happen when a suspect, particularly one who is young, mentally vulnerable, or exhausted, actually comes to believe they may have committed the crime. The interrogation creates doubt about their own memory. There is a man named Peter Riley who in 1973 was interrogated for 16 hours after his mother was found murdered. He was 18 years old. By the end of the interrogation, he had confessed to the murder. By the end of the investigation, he had come to believe, genuinely, that he might have done it, that his memory of the evening was wrong, that perhaps the interrogator's version of events was true. He was convicted. 2 years later, new evidence cleared him entirely. He had been home at the time of the murder. Other witnesses confirmed it. His confession was the product of 16 hours of sustained psychological pressure on a teenager who had just lost his mother. The conviction of innocent people on the basis of false confessions is not a rare occurrence. The Innocence Project has found that in approximately 29% of DNA exoneration cases, a false confession or incriminating statement was a contributing factor, nearly a third. In case after case, the confession that seemed like the most direct possible evidence of guilt, more convincing than forensic evidence, more convincing than witness testimony, was the thing that was wrong. The reforms researchers have proposed are straightforward. Mandatory recording of all interrogations from beginning to end would allow courts and juries to evaluate the conditions under which confessions were obtained. Time limits on interrogations would reduce the psychological deterioration that makes false confessions more likely. Prohibition on false evidence ploys, telling suspects about evidence that does not exist, would remove one of the most powerful tools for producing false confessions. Training interrogators in the science of memory and decision-making under stress would replace a technique built on false assumptions with one built on what we actually know. Some of these reforms have been implemented in some jurisdictions. Most have not. The Reed technique is still taught. False evidence ploys are still legal. Interrogations are still sometimes conducted for many hours without recording. And somewhere right now, in an interrogation room, someone who did not do it is being told that they did, that the evidence proves it, that confessing is the only way out, that they can go home if they just say the words. And the terrifying thing is that sometimes, after enough hours, they do. The Exonerated Five, 6 to 13 years, for a crime committed by one man they had never met, caught by their own words, in a room designed to produce exactly that outcome. The reforms exist, the science exists. The will to implement them does not. An innocent person would never confess. That is what we tell ourselves. And somewhere right now, someone innocent is proving us wrong.